Welcome to the Compliance 911 Show, a no-nonsense podcast discussing hot topics for today's busy compliance professional. It's everything you wanted to know about regulatory compliance, but we're afraid to ask. And now, here are your hosts, Dean Stockford of M&M Consulting and Len Suzio of GeoData Vision.
So what interesting topics did you bring to our discussion today, Len?
Well, Dean, as we're recording this in January, I've been focused the OCC's proposed simplified strategic plan process for community banks. At first I thought that it would be too narrow a topic to be of much interest to all our listeners. But as I reflected on the proposal, I realized that there are some very important insights that apply to all intermediate, small, and large banks, whether they are interested in the CRA strategic plan option or not. So that's what I plan to discuss today, Dean.
Well, you certainly have piqued my interest, Len. What are you talking about when you say that a proposal aimed at the CRA strategic plan option contains valuable insights for all ISBs and large banks, whether they are interested in CRA strategic plan or not?
On December 18th,
yeah, expand.
Well, it's true, only a handful of banks have ever used a CRA strategic plan. And I'm going to applaud the agency for trying to do something to make it a little bit easier. And on December 18th of 2025, the OCC did publish a proposed, quote, simplified plan process for community banks. And the goal of the proposal, according to the agency, is to make the strategic plan option more accessible to and less burdensome for community banks. At first glance, it would seem that the proposal will be of interest only to OCC-regulated banks and only those banks interested in a CRA strategic plan. But as I studied the proposal and I thought about it, I realized that the proposal provided a view of how regulators rate performance under the normal CRA test. The proposal identifies two types of goals to be included in a proposed strategic plan, what it calls the elective goals and the custom goals. The custom goals are bank-specific goals to be used when the elective goals are not suitable for the bank based on its performance context. And that's a quote directly from the agency itself. The proposal, insofar as those unique situations are concerned, is of little use. But it is the elective goals that the agency proposes that I find useful and instructive for banks, whether they are interested in a CRA strategic plan or not. I say this because the proposal offers specific examples and quantifiable measurements for elective goals that would correspond to satisfactory or outstanding performance ratings. And other than the 2023 CRA rule, which has been rescinded, the agencies have never published anything like that. Anything specific. It's always been generalized.
Well, pardon me for interrupting, Len, but it seems to me that most banks that develop CRA strategic plans are doing so because they believe, under the circumstances, that normal CRA performance standards don't necessarily apply to them. In other words, those banks would propose bank-specific goals, what the OCC calls custom goals in the proposal. Am I correct?
Yes, Gene, you are correct. And the OCC's proposal gives no real guidance on those situations that are truly unique, and which are the real reason why most banks that have used the strategic plan option do so. The proposal focuses mainly on the elective goals that the agency says is developed by considering measurable goals in approved strategic plans and the OCC's experience in evaluating community banks' performance under the otherwise applicable performance tests and standards. So ironically, I don't see the proposed custom goals as being very useful for strategic plans that truly require different performance measures, but the elective goals definitely are relevant. The elective goals developed by the agency would apply under otherwise performance tests and standards, and that's where there's real insight to be gained for banks that don't use the strategic plan option. To be sure, in typical regulatory gobbledygook, what the agency gives in one hand, it takes back with the other when it says, quote, the elective goals are not safe harbors. But it may be indeed modified based on public comments. Nonetheless, the proposal does offer very specific quantified performance standards that should help any bank develop its own internal performance goals for CRA purposes. And that's where bank CRA officers can gain valuable insights as they set their bank's CRA performance goals and conduct their own internal review of their bank's CRA performance.
Okay, so I'm glad you explained the typical bureaucratic mucky muck. So let's hear what CRA performance insights can be found in this proposal, even for banks not planning on using that strategic plan option.
Okay, Dean. Well, in my opinion, one of the murkiest areas in terms of CRA performance is with respect to community development. And that's where the proposal is especially helpful because it provides explicit elective performance goals for community development lending, community development investments, and community development services. With respect to community development lending, the OCC identifies 12 different potential measurements for satisfactory performance and another 12 goals for potential outstanding performance ratings. The benchmarks include different percentages of Tier 1 capital and or percentages of assets based on the dollar value of the community development lending relative to Tier 1 capital or asset size. The lowest satisfactory benchmarks are based on 1% of Tier 1 capital or 0.08% of total assets for small community banks to 3% of Tier 1 capital or 0.24% of assets for larger community banks to attain a satisfactory performance rating. The Agency for Outstanding Performance under the Community Development Lending Test proposes 2% of Tier 1 capital or 0.16% of total assets for small community banks up to 3% of Tier 1 capital or 0.40% of total assets for larger community banks. Similarly, with respect to community development investing, the agency does delineate 15 goals, different goals, for satisfactory performance and 16 possible goals for outstanding performance. And once again, the goals all relate to Tier 1 capital or total assets. However, the goals are as low as 0.2% of assets for, quote, less complex community banks, where at least 50% of their investment performance is attributable to donations. This, to the best of my knowledge, after 31 years of CRA consulting, is the first and only acknowledgement by regulators that many community banks satisfy their community development investment responsibility by making donations rather than traditional investments. And the regulators have announced a lower standard in recognition that $100,000 worth of donations is much more significant than $100,000 of loans or traditional investments. And by the way, the proposal indicates that for outstanding community development investing, a goal of 0.06% of assets would be appropriate. Proposal also identifies goals for satisfactory and outstanding performance based on a combination of community development lending and investing. That's a performance test that I've never seen before, except in the 2023 CRA rule, which is no longer effective. In the OCC proposal, they offer satisfactory and outstanding standards based on a percentage of Tier 1 capital from 1% to 5%, or percentages of assets from 0.12% to 0.40%. And finally, with respect to community development services, the proposal suggests 2 hours of community development service volunteer time per full-time employee per year for satisfactory performance and 4 hours time per full-time employee per year for outstanding performance. Once again, never have the regulators provided any guidance regarding the quantitative standards for community services. So this is a first and should really get CRA officers' attention. Now, with respect to the so-called lending test, the OCC proposal provides nothing specific other than to reiterate the standard benchmarks for the demographic and borrower characteristics test. So there's nothing to be learned on that matter.
Len, by my count, you've referred to quite a few performance measurements, about, let's see, 61 or so. I'm certain our listeners are interested in getting the details on those proposed performance standards. What do you suggest?
Well, what we're going to do is at the end of this podcast, we're going to post a link to our website, which will contain a document that shows all the proposed performance standards put forward by the OCC for strategic plans. That link will be provided immediately after this broadcast. I do want to point out that the OCC in footnotes to the proposal says that, quote, the elective goals should not be considered benchmarks for satisfactory or outstanding CRA performance outside the simplified strategic plan process. But at the same time, it states that the elective goals are consistent with the performance measures and performance levels that the agency historically has expected of community banks with satisfactory or outstanding ratings. So in light of that statement, I believe the elective goals are extremely useful for banks to consider when they are operating under the normal CRA performance standards. And therefore, all bankers listening to this podcast should give them consideration and should definitely inspect all those 61 tests and standards which we will make available.
I think you may have stimulated a lot of interest in the OCC simplified strategic plan process, even for banks not regulated by the OCC. So it sounds like a good idea for all CRA officers to retrieve the proposal and study it, particularly the elective goals. This is Dean Stockford from M&M Consulting.
And this is Len Suzio with Geodata Vision saying we hope you enjoyed today's podcast. And again, we encourage you to review the goals which are going to be provided in the description, in a link in the description of this podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Compliance 911 Show. If you like the podcast, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. While you're at it, please give us a like and review to help others find the show. As always, links are in the show notes, and you can always find us online at compliance911show.com. Follow M&M Consulting and Geodata Vision on LinkedIn for all the latest news and information on compliance hot topics.